Judith Cochrane, a member of the Assembly's Committee for Finance and Personnel, will provide some opening comments, and then we'll hear a presentation from Joanne Wilson from Queen's University, and she's based in the School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work. The presentation itself will take about 30 minutes, and that will be followed by a 30-minute discussion, and this will give you an opportunity to put forward some questions to Joanne and maybe present your views on the contents of the presentation. Thereafter, tea and coffee will be provided. This will give you an opportunity to network with the other attendees here today, and it's also going to be followed with a tour of Parliament buildings for those who are interested. And finally, can I just ask you, if you have your mobile phones with you and switched on, could you please turn them off or check and turn them on silent? And I'd also like you to note that the presentation will be video recorded, but the discussion itself will not, so please feel free to open and discuss as you wish. I'll now hand it over to Judith.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome you here to Parliament Buildings today on this slightly sunny day-ish. I'm a member of the Committee for Finance and Personnel, and I welcome the opportunity to open today's seminar entitled Understandings of Wellbeing, Implications for Public Policy. It's long been argued that the progress of the country should not be measured by looking just at growth in GDP. Progress should not be assessed in pounds and pence alone, although it is hard to escape discussion and debate on the state of our economy. For a full picture of how a country is doing, we need to look at the wider measures of both economic and social progress. The Department of Finance and Personnel is responsible for developing measures of wellbeing through the work of the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency and in conjunction with the Office for National Statistics. This is important as there is a relationship between changes in population wellbeing and meeting government priorities such as raising educational attainment, reducing health inequalities and crime reduction. Indeed, developing better measures of wellbeing and progress is a common international goal, and within the UK there is a commitment to developing wider measures of wellbeing so that government policies can be more tailored to the things that matter, and Northern Ireland is currently piloting new measures of subjective wellbeing. The research recognises that wider and systematic consideration of wellbeing has the potential to lead better decisions by government, markets and the public, and as such better outcomes. And here in the Assembly, I believe strongly that we should be identifying the key drivers for population wellbeing as a basis to influence policy formulation and investment. This will allow us to join up different policy areas at the formulation stage. For example, addressing emotional wellbeing might require action across a range of departments, for example, with health, children and families, employment and communities. And this will become all the more important as we plan to deal with the impact of welfare reform changes that are coming our way. So with this in mind, I would like to welcome Joanne Wilson and Lindsay Pryor from Queen's University Belfast, who will consider what is meant by wellbeing, the implications for public policy and how public policy can advance the nation's wellbeing by protecting and promoting both the individual and the common good. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to begin by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about different understandings of well-being. That is the intention of the presentation. I hope by having a look at these multiple understandings, we'll be able to gain a sense of clarity as regards the concept's rise to political hegemony, and in particular its implications for public policy across Northern Ireland. I'm going to be discussing two different discourses that have been mentioned, the individual and the common good, and how these act as a template for policy, informing its development, including the methods that we use to measure and monitor well-being, as well as the types of interventions that we develop to advance well-being across different contexts over the life course. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin the presentation by just situating the current wellbeing agenda in context, briefly etching the concept's origins in public policy. I'll then explore some definitions of wellbeing and introduce the two dominant discourses, so the individual versus the common good. And I'll then progress on to discussing some facts and figures as regards the current status of the Northern Irish population as regards well-being, and illustrate how well-being is generally understood in strategic policy documents, and conclude by using a well-being framework to make some tentative suggestions as to how we can improve well-being within the population. So, to begin, the shift towards well-being has a long and protracted history. It can be traced back to antiquity, when philosophers have grappled with trying to understand the construct and instructing people on how to achieve well-being through the manner in which they live their lives. For the ancient Greeks, well-being was an arduous task. It demanded introspection and reflection on you as a person and your values and your character, and whether you were leading a life that comprised of meaning and purpose. Well-being was about doing good. It wasn't about feeling good, although this could occasionally surface as a byproduct. There was no magic bullet to appease misery or pain, or a pill to pop for a better life. Somewhere along the line, however, this has shifted, and nowadays well-being is a right. It's something to which we're all entitled, and to which we can have instant access and receive with minimal effort. In contemporary society, well-being has become a commodity. We can seek life coaches, we can seek health gurus to help us reconnect with our inner zen and to achieve nirvana. There are websites, books, community groups, and even mobile applications that provide endless advice on how to look good, to feel good, simply because we're worth it. If we put enough money at it, we should be able to improve our well-being. Yet there's mounting evidence that well-being is not something we can buy. The graph on this slide shows the relationship between UK life satisfaction plotted against gross domestic product over a 30-year period, and it clearly illustrates a monotonic relationship between GDP and life satisfaction. So as GDP has increased, reported levels of life satisfaction at the aggregate level have remained stable. So while there may be the potential for income to improve well-being at an individual level, this does not translate to population well-being. And this fact has become known as the Easterland paradox, and it afflicts many affluent societies today, including Northern Ireland. The paradox has also been the impetus for many initiatives and also publications questioning the utility of GDP as the sole measure of economic and social progress. And over the last decade in particular, there have been numerous publications, including the Stiglitz report, the NEF report, which calls for national accounts of well-being, and a report by the National Economic and Social Council in the Republic of Ireland entitled Wellbeing Matters. And each of these not only question GDP as a measure, but also call for additional measures to supplement GDP, and in particular measures of subjective well-being, or as we colloquially call it, happiness. And since 2010, the government has been very much interested in developing new measures of subjective well-being. But this isn't new, and it can be traced to 1972, when the fourth Dragon King of Bhutan made an off-the-cuff remark that we should be measuring gross national happiness. It reflected an intention to build and develop an economy that would serve Bhutan's culture based on spiritual values, as opposed to a Western culture concerned with GDP and economic growth. If we're going to promote well-being then within public policy, be it subjective well-being or happiness, however you want to define it, it requires an understanding of what the construct actually involves. Yet it is a nebulous construct. It's difficult to conceptualise and to define, and as yet attempts to reach a universal definition appear to be a long way off. Focusing on a line of academic inquiry as well is unlikely to help either, as the object of the assessment differs across different disciplines. So if we look at the medical and health literature, well-being is very much viewed as a positive state of physical functioning. It's enhanced by avoiding harmful behaviours such as smoking, drinking to excess and taking drugs, while simultaneously engaging in salubrious acts such as taking exercise and healthy eating. Within the economic literature, well-being is very much viewed as the extent to which we have access to goods and services that are deemed necessary for an acceptable standard of living, and this really is things that we view as necessities for life. So things like an adequate house, adequate diet, adequate heating. And within psychology, it differs again, and it's viewed as a positive state of being, defined in terms of cognitions, so things like life satisfaction, and also affectivity, and this includes the presence of positive affect and the absence of negative affect, both in terms of moods and emotions. There is agreement, however, that well-being is a state. It's a person's current state of being, so whether they're healthy or happy at a given point in time. It is also a process that involves making an evaluation of whether you are being well or being ill. And it's also an outcome, the end product of how you feel at that time. So while we may not be able to define well-being, we have an idea of what it encapsulates. And there are many terms within the English vocabulary that can allude to the essence of well-being. So things like happiness, welfare, standard of living, quality of life, etc. And it's important not to negate or to trivialise the multiplicity of these terms, because such terms are important in facilitating our dialogue with other individuals who are working towards a similar aim, albeit across different areas or different departments, be it community groups, industry, voluntary organisations as well. The multiplicity of terms also facilitates our dialogue with the public. It allows us to discuss technical terms and to make the topic more tangible and concrete that they are able to grasp. However, unless we openly acknowledge its pluralism, therein lies its downfall. By using the term interchangeably, so well-being, with a variety of other concepts like standard of living or quality of life, we're really serving to muddy the already muddied waters, because these concepts also lack conceptual clarity. And with no idea as to what well-being is or how to measure it, it's hard to envisage how we can apply it effectively to public policy. So where do we go from here? We decided to explore how academics would talk and write of well-being within the literature over the last 2 decades, and to do this we undertook a conceptual mapping exercise. I'm not going to go into the methodology now, but there is a paper if anybody would like a copy of it, let me know. But the results of that exercise identified 15 common words from over 2,000 expressions, and you can see them here. Some of the words have grown in usage over time, so we're starting to see things like subjective and happiness appear more frequently in the literature. Other words appear to be languishing over time, so things like quality of life and welfare are diminishing somewhat, whilst other words remain robust. Things like economic and health and well-being is frequently used together within the literature and practice. This diagram also alludes to 2 dominant discourses that are prevalent within the literature. The first is that we can conceive well-being in terms of individual well-being, something that is the property of individuals that only they can experience and feel. And that's represented by terms such as individual, happiness, and health. But equally, well-being is something else. There is a collective element to it that cannot just be understood by reference to individuals alone, and that's grasped by the other concepts such as social, development, and welfare, for example. Understandings of individual well-being are underpinned by 2 different schools of thought that are indicative of ancient understandings, the hedonic and the eudaimonic. Hedonia, or hedonic understandings, are underpinned by the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, and he formulated the greatest happiness principle, reasoning that it is the role of policy to maximise happiness for the greatest number of people by promoting those pleasurable activities and discouraging harmful or distasteful acts. Difficulties in measuring these mental states, however, soon shifted attention away from subjective indicators of well-being towards more objective indicators, and until recently, preference realisation accounts have been the dominant paradigm in public policy. Yet over the last 2 years, there has been another shift, and we're beginning to regress towards mental states, or back to Bentham as it's commonly known. And this has emerged against a backdrop of understanding which suggests that one, happiness is the main goal of humans. It is an end in itself. It is measurable. We know what makes people happy, and it is the role of policy to make most people happy for most of the time. And for hedonists, income is one way in which we can secure well-being or happiness. But for the eudaimonists, Money is only of instrumental value. It is a means to an end. It is not an end in itself. It lacks intrinsic value. And their interpretation is often accredited to Aristotle and translated as flourishing. For them, eudaimonia reflects the extent to which an individual has a sense of coherence or life purpose. Well-being therefore results from virtuous acts such as courage, valour, generosity, justice and fairness. A good life is a life that's lived according to one's true potential through moderation and reason. Until recently, policy has endorsed the view that increases in wealth perpetuate increases in well-being. This relates to the purchasing power of money. Richer people are happier because they have more disposable income, which affords them greater freedom to behave how they please. And while this may be true at an individual level, as the Easterlin paradox shows, this does not translate to the aggregate or national level. Aggregate increases in income are not matched with aggregate increases in well-being. This means that well-being cannot be understood by reference to individuals alone, and we need to consider processes and structures which impact on the common good, and this is often measured using other indices such as inequality or environmental degradation, which also impacts on well-being. But essentially, the common good says that society is more than the sum of its parts, and an exclusive focus on individual misses out on these alternative approaches. The common good reflects those goods which are shared by all members of a society, but are not private to any one individual, so-called public wealth. Essentially, the common good is the whole of various institutions, social activities, customs, habits, or what we term structures of living together, which emerge from a life in common, from the relationships between people. They are irreducible social goods, goods which are a part of well-being, but only exist because people share them. And one of the most obvious examples of the common good would be the National Health Service. It is an institution which is a concrete example of the irreducible social good of social cohesion, but today is slowly being eroded by the promotion of individualism. Within the academic literature, the capabilities approach is perhaps the closest account to endorse the common good. It prioritises those institutions, processes, and structures which, independent of sensations, but would still allow happiness and satisfaction to flourish. And if policy is to advance the individual good, or the individual well-being, or happiness as it's been referred to, it is important to consider those structures of living together, the common good, which determine in the first instance what the citizens of a given society are likely to value or have reason to value. So what can we take from this information? One definition that has been proposed by the Wellbeing Matters report is this, and it suggests that well-being is a positive physical, social and mental state. It requires that basic needs are met, that individuals have a sense of purpose, that they feel they are able to lead the lives they value and have reason to value. This is not an agreed definition, but it is a starting point and a working definition. And perhaps more importantly, it alludes to 6 domains of well-being which are considered important, and they are economic resources, work or participation in life, relationships, community and the environment, health, values and democracy. So I'm going to touch on some of those and see how Northern Ireland is faring out across each of those 6 domains. But before I do so, I'd just like to give a brief overview of some key demographic trends. Since June 2009 to the end of June 2010, these are the most recent figures that I have, the population has increased by 0.6%. That gives an overall increase of roughly 10,500 people. This change is basically due to natural change, so births and deaths. And Dungannon has experienced one of the greatest population increases, which is up 2.3%. The latest figures also reveal a downward trend in migration, which is in keeping with previous years. But nonetheless, there are approximately 80,000 people who've been born outside of the UK that are living in Northern Ireland in 2010. And we also have an increase in lone parents, going by the 2009 to 2010 figures. An increase in population size and diversity impacts on well-being. Population changes have implications for the planning and the provision of services. For example, as regards migrants, there are challenges to be faced as regards jobs, healthcare, housing, the need to ensure that these individuals are effectively integrated into society in Northern Ireland, and similarly for lone parents, there's a need to ensure that they have adequate support. In relation to the fiscal circumstances, work is also important for well-being. It's important that individuals are engaged in meaningful work, and figures show that unemployment is down 0.5% from the previous quarter in Northern Ireland. That is lower than the UK and the European average, which is good on one hand. However, it needs to be balanced against an increase in economic inactivity. Northern Ireland has the highest rates of inactivity compared to the UK, and the claimant count in Northern Ireland right up until February of this year continued to rise at a rate of 6.9%. We also have a high percentage of young people who are so-called NEETs, not in education, employment or training, and approximately 1 in 5 people between the ages of 16 to 24 years fall into that bracket. And this is important because, given the importance of work for the individual, for the family and community, these figures are quite worrisome. As regards to the economic domain of well-being, up here I have gross value added in Northern Ireland and UK annual gross domestic product. We're coming in at 0.8% in 2011. PricewaterhouseCoopers puts Northern Ireland's figure, gross value added figure, at 0.02% for this year. And this trend sets to continue. The publication of the IMF report in January 2012 suggests that the Eurozone had fallen into a mild recession, so the future is bleak at best. In terms of this graph, this shows the Gini coefficient, which measures the inequality of income distribution. It is a ratio with values between 0 and 1, where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality. The Gini coefficient in the UK stood at approximately 34% in December 2010, which was higher than Sweden and Ireland. This graph shows that over the last 30 years or so, the Gini coefficient has been increasing within the UK, so levels of inequality are increasing. And this suggests, there is a suggestion that more unequal societies experience lower life expectancies, higher rates of infant mortality, higher rates of obesity, higher rates of mental illness, lower standards of education, and that individuals are more likely to be murdered. And with the rising Gini coefficient, this suggests that the future is not so bright. In relation to some of the other well-being domains, the quality and the stability of relationships is also important for well-being. In Northern Ireland, the number of marriages has increased since 1995, despite some fluctuations. We're looking at an increase of 5.1%, but this has been offset by a double in the rate of divorces at 11.5%. Health is a fundamental aspect of well-being. Life expectancy for males and females has increased, which is promising, and perhaps also promising is that in the most 20% of the most deprived wards, males and female life expectancy has also increased. However, the increase within these wards is less than elsewhere, thus suggesting a widening deprivation gap. Also, in relation to income inequality, which I'd mentioned, there tends to be an increase in mental illness, and perhaps the most extreme of this is suicide, which tends to increase during a recession. Rates of suicide peaked in 2010, and although they have fallen somewhat in 2011, they're still pretty high, with 289 suicides. And since 1997, the rate has actually increased by 52.2%, which is substantial. Psychosocial problems also exacerbate unhealthy behaviours. And again, while the 2011 figure for drug and alcohol related deaths has decreased, over the 10-year period there has been an 18.3% increase. Just a few other points that I'd like to touch on in relation to Northern Ireland. The The first is in relation to community or environmental aspects, which are also important for well-being. In Northern Ireland, the Climate Change Act in 2008 provided a legislative framework for the UK and Northern Ireland to reduce greenhouse gases from the 1990 levels by 34% by 2022 and by 80% by 2050. It seems that the population are aware of the importance of the environment. They appear to be pretty concerned about it, although this figure has dropped in previous years. In relation to having necessities, I've just put up an example here of the internet, just to show that there's approximately 67% of households in Northern Ireland own a house and computer, but again, broadband access is highest in the least deprived areas, and again, these inequality issues have repercussions for well-being. The final domain for well-being is trust, and I'm using an example here in relation to crime. Crime can obviously have a serious impact on well-being, but so can the perception of crime. And there is a tendency within Northern Ireland for people to believe that crime is higher than it is, more so than in England and Wales, and in fact we do have a lower crime rate. And this perhaps draws attention, on one hand, to the importance of studying subjective indicators and measuring subjective well-being. And recently, the UK government has published some experimental results from pilot questions which explored subjective well-being across the 4 nations. So while our levels of satisfaction or happiness appear to have stabilised over a 30-year period, we're actually doing okay in terms of these figures. The results are quite high. We're coming in at 7 out of 10. Northern Ireland topped the 4 nations, but I should point out that those differences were quite negligible, and in relation to anxiety, there was greater variability. What these results show is that it is important to consider the individual well-being. It's important to consider the individual good. Asking people to comment on the conditions in which they live their life can prove telling. It can uncover obscured idiosyncrasies as regards what people want and need in order to improve their lives. Furthermore, it's a vital aspect of the policy process, given that there's mounting evidence to suggest that the subjective experience and the objective condition do not always align. Individuals might report being happy or satisfied with their lives despite living in abject conditions, and vice versa. So understanding the point at which subjective interpretations both converge and diverge with objective conditions is crucial to inform policy and advance well-being. Asking individuals to decide what they value for their well-being is also important, and it avoids claims of paternalism, which seems to be ethically and morally defensible. Individuals ought to have the freedom to behave in ways that they see fit. However, while there are claims, that many of the perceptions that individuals have are somewhat faulty, but I think it needs to be borne in mind that regardless of these faulty perceptions, they are the perceptions by which individuals live out their lives. Policies which hyperbolise well-being or the individual good place individuals at the centre of the policy process. Such policies endeavour to improve well-being through the way in which individuals live their lives across the lifespan and across specific domains. And inevitably, the types of objectives and targets that are set are likely to focus on helping individuals to make better, more informed choices as regards how they live their lives. So within Investing for Health, for example, a key objective was to enable people to make healthier choices. However, modern accounts which are focused on subjective well-being tend to endorse a sensory or a propositional approach where well-being is reduced to feelings and attitudes that people want to experience, such as happiness and satisfaction. But this ignores the common good. Individual approaches also ignore the institutions which actually impact on their ability to lead a healthy life. Responsibility for improving and sustaining well-being rests solely with the individual. Furthermore, focusing on the majority and promoting the interests of the majority fails to consider how changes may impact on the well-being of the subservient and the minority. For example, policies are unlikely to advance well-being for the entire nation when fruit and vegetables are becoming a luxury good for the most poverty-stricken members of society. Such accounts also ignore the relational nature of the construct, whereby our interactions with others provide us with support, cohesion, a sense of identity and belonging, and actually contribute to well-being. Asking people what they need to advance their well-being also assumes that they know what they need to advance their well-being, yet this is no mean feat. It requires weighing up the pros and cons across a number of competing options and prioritising how resources are allocated. And people are fallible beings. They're capable of trivial and ill-informed choices, and they're vulnerable to biases, which all can impinge on their well-being. And as regards subjective well-being, there are a number of measurement issues with that alone, as regards language translations, questions ordering, wording, positioning within surveys, and they're marred with biases as regards the mood and the timing of the survey as well. Policies which endorse collective well-being are a common good, place society at the centre of policy, and they strive to develop and sustain those institutions, those structures and processes, the very infrastructure or the scaffolding which allows individual well-being to flourish. Policies which seek to advance a common good recognise that there are common goods to be shared, and they focus on those structures of living together which affect the opportunities and the choices that are presented to people. Thus, if we re-articulate the healthier choices example in investing for health as a common good, this would involve redirecting our attention towards those higher order structures which influence people's decisions, such as the accessibility and the affordability of fruit and vegetables, and perhaps more importantly, the monopoly of shelf space by larger conglomerates in supermarkets. Too few policies actually address the common good, and one exception is the Investing for Health strategy. In attempting to help people make healthier choices, it also makes other claims, including the intention to improve our neighbourhoods and wider environment. And I think one objective is to enhance the quality of the air, so a common good which affects individuals but is not reducible to any one person. As regards academic interpretations of the common good, they still remain very much individualistic. The capabilities approach, which I mentioned earlier, is the best approach, but it still focuses on the individual at the outcome, promoting whatever is in the best interest of the person as opposed to society. And this is problematic in that, again, it assumes that the individuals should be responsible for their own well-being, and other pertinent actors such as other government departments, community groups, volunteer groups who have a key role to play are erroneously excluded. And part of the problem is probably because the common good is challenging to conceptualise, to define and measure, and it's quite idealistic. And there's also a need to consider, when we are looking at the common good, the unit of the common good. For example, there was a controversial decision, I think it was last year, as regards a high-speed train link between London and Birmingham. That was, on one hand, would contribute to the common good by creating more job opportunities, but it was also going to destroy an area of natural beauty, and it was going to displace people that were already living there. So whose good are we talking about? This diagram is taken from the Wellbeing Matters report, and it's useful in showing what a wellbeing approach to policy would involve. Essentially, it shows the intrapersonal level, which is the person and their individual capabilities, alongside their interpersonal connections with family and friends, which are turned and situated within the wider economic, political and social milieu in which they exist and live out their lives. Public policy needs to consider all three of these aspects and the interdependence between all three if they seek to advance well-being. It is the role, therefore, of public policy to advance the nation's well-being by protecting and promoting both the individual and the common good. This involves acknowledging and supporting freedoms at the individual level for people to live the lives that they value and have reason to value. However, it also means having well-functioning institutions which support individuals' well-being and their relationships with others, their family and friends and work colleagues, etc. I'm just going to conclude by using a wellbeing framework to make some tentative suggestions as to how public policy might address and hence advance the individual and the common good. First, to address the individual good, public policy can ensure individuals have the capabilities to advance their own well-being by ensuring individuals have an adequate income to meet the basic living standards as endorsed by the values of the society in which they live. One way to do this would be to ensure individuals are involved in meaningful activity. This includes not just work-related activity, but other activities such as skill-based learning and confidence-building activities. We can also use choice architecture to nudge individuals' behaviour and influence and improve the decisions that people reach in ways that benefit their well-being. We can ensure that individuals have an adequate work-life balance to meet personal and family needs and responsibilities through flexible working and job sharing, etc. We can ensure affordable facilities for health and recreation, and there are already attempts at this in terms of outdoor gyms. And we can also provide supports to help individuals to live independently and make informed decisions. Public policy can also address the common good and instigate a cultural shift from a militant society concerned with the survival of the fittest to an egalitarian society by promoting sustainable development instead of extensive and intensive rapid GDP growth, by ensuring equal distribution of income in place of income growth per head, by working towards a participation as opposed to an employment rate, by ensuring that there is access to a viable education system right across the life course, by providing and sustaining an affordable healthcare system for all, by shifting from housing completion rates to actual occupancy rates, and by shifting towards a cooperative economy where businesses are both owned and run by its members. And finally, by strengthening and rebuilding the trade unions. Thank you.